Hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all present, and welcome to my presentation about exploring culture in cases of metabolic syndrome for South Asian adolescents. My name is Vaibhav Chaudhary and I am my team's first author. Joining me is Miss Ashley Hodge and Miss Carissa Pertler from UCLA, who are both my co-authors. This study has been a long time in the making, but we are finally ready and excited to dive into the role that culture plays in dictating the prevalence of metabolic syndrome for South Asians. But before we dive in, it's important to discuss some of these buzzwords and provide the necessary context for the topic at hand. Let's take a moment to consider what metabolic syndrome really is. It's a cluster of 5 conditions that together increase the risk of heart disease, stroke, or type 2 diabetes. These conditions include high blood sugar, high blood pressure, low cholesterol, high triglycerides, or excess waist fat. It may come as a surprise, but approximately 1 in every 4 South Asians are already diagnosed with this syndrome. Indeed, the frightening reality is that many adolescents today are already at risk for developing it, as South Asia has one of the highest rates of metabolic syndrome in the world. You may be wondering, why is this happening? Is it purely genetics, or could there be other factors at play? While some sources argue that genetics is to blame, this study aims to show that culture is actually an underlying factor for this crisis. So what do we exactly mean by culture? How does a society's customs and its social behavior affect its health, and its ability to remain informed of its health? Well, believe it or not, culture has historically been a bearer of suffering and harmful practices because every society is determined to uplift and maintain their culture. Small examples like foot binding in China or the missionary movement in Europe illustrate how culture can perpetuate harmful norms. While at a grander scale, culture has been the driving force behind issues like slavery in the US or anti-Semitism in Germany. While this may seem like a stretch, it does illustrate a fundamental problem of humanity. Historically, people have suffered at the hands of outdated and detrimental rules simply because it was taboo to break them. And although South Asia has had its fair share of problems, namely arranged marriages of the caste system, the real reason that explains why metabolic syndrome is so prevalent in this region is because culture directly plays a role in lifestyle and diet. To understand that a little bit better, let's unpack the typical meal of an average South Asian. The South Asian diet, especially in immigrant communities, tends to be high in refined carbs, deep-fried foods, and saturated fats, and often lacks adequate protein intake. Combine this with cultural norms that discourage open discussion about health, mental wellness, or well-being, and we have a serious under-addressed problem. And this problem stems from the fact that from the moment they're born, children growing up in South Asia are usually only exposed to carbs in their meals, the staples being rice and potatoes. And since these two foods are present at every meal, it becomes habitual for children to grow up with little portions of protein and excess amounts of fried foods and fats, leading to muscle loss or obesity. To make things worse is the abundance of sweet, sugary products available for consumption. Since parents often feed these sweets to their kids on festivals or special occasions, we see a rise in blood sugar and eventually a higher risk for diabetes. And these dietary patterns become evident in lifestyle as well. As once they're established in childhood, they tend to follow into adulthood. Even with efforts to adopt healthier choices later on, the foundational habits make it difficult to enact meaningful change. The result? Millions of people who now have to live with the thought of their life on the line at any moment. This brings us to an essential element of our research, health literacy. The reason many sources that discuss health fail to enact change is because there may be insufficient reasoning regarding a health issue and/or there is a lack of availability and support. By improving the means to access reliable health information and encouraging open communication and discussion for teenagers, we can empower them to make smarter choices and, for this study, fundamentally change the harmful tenets of culture to the South Asian teenager. Thus, my research intends to fill the gap in scientific conversations about metabolic syndrome for South Asian adolescents by exploring how often culture and diet are included in them. By identifying this gap, we can move toward more culturally informed public health strategies that improve outcomes for millions. To examine trends in metabolic syndrome literature, we use the Web of Science database, which includes a comprehensive range of peer-reviewed journals across disciplines. By using specific search terms like South Asian adolescents, metabolic syndrome, and culture and diet, we were able to generate 1,218 preliminary results. After applying filters and removing articles not within the context of metabolic syndrome, we were left with 634 results, of which we are exported our top 100 most cited sources into Google Sheets for analysis. From there, we reviewed the articles to identify the most common research trends and gaps in culture, diet, and health literacy in South Asian adolescent populations. And after some thorough analysis, we were able to determine certain outcomes. We noted how most journals came from respected South Asian institutions, and most authors who co-wrote multiple articles received various awards and were distinguished experts in their field. Additionally, we found that the majority of articles focused strictly on prevalence, medical risk factors, and genetic predispositions. They often mentioned how adolescents were affected by obesity, insulin resistance, or cardiovascular conditions, and sometimes they tracked age or location-based differences in how metabolic syndrome presents. For example, 31 articles out of the 100 confined their research to specific regions and cities of various South Asian countries, notably India and Pakistan. Some regions they focused on include North, South, Central, and Western India, and some cities that they mentioned were Kolkata, Pune, Chennai in India, and Karachi and Lahore in Pakistan. Additionally, many compared the difference in prevalence of metabolic syndrome between urban and rural locations, with 15 articles mentioning urban in their journal title and 10 mentioning rural. What was consistently missing, though, was any in-depth analysis of cultural and dietary factors, the things that shape these health outcomes in the first place. To prove these claims, we can conduct a chi-square test for goodness of fit. By observing 26 articles out of our top 100 most cited that are relevant to culture and diet, and by setting 50 articles as the expected number for our null hypothesis, we can check off the 3 conditions necessary for a chi-square test and use the formula to arrive at a test statistic of approximately 23.04. From there, we can use the calculator to find our p-value. First, we set our lower bound number as our test statistic of 23.04, our upper bound number as any high number, and our degrees of freedom as 1 since we're using a 2x2 table. At that point, the calculator will return a value of approximately 1.59 times 10 to the negative 6th. Since this p-value is much less than any acceptable value for alpha, we reject the null hypothesis that there is no difference in the number of articles that mention culture as a factor for metabolic syndrome versus those that do not discuss it, and instead we find evidence that there is a difference in the number of the 2 article types. In short, we find that the literature is rich in numbers, but poor in context. So why does this all matter in the first place? Because without understanding the cultural context, medical interventions will often fail. You can tell a 16-year-old South Asian boy to cut out rice and chapati in his meals, but if that's what his family eats every single day, then what are his real options? You can tell him to eat more protein, but if vegetarianism is a religious or cultural norm in the household, then where is that protein going to come from? You can educate his parents about cholesterol, but if there's stigma around even talking about body weight, then will they listen? These cultural factors aren't just background noise. They're central to the development, treatment, and prevention of metabolic syndrome. And yet, current literature largely ignores them. Our bibliometric analysis shows that we're focusing too much on surface-level stats, and not on the deeper systemic reasons that make South Asian adolescents so vulnerable to this chronic illness. Thus, this research has 2 implications. Number 1, we need more culturally aware studies that explore how tradition, food, and lifestyle intersect with adolescent health. And I believe the best way to tackle this is to change the mindset. If we are finding that for every 100 articles on South Asia, 74 articles are simply mentioning stats and facts, then there's clearly a misguided mindset contributing to it. So let's embrace openness. That's where true growth begins. And second, public health messaging needs to evolve. It needs to be more relevant, more accessible, and tailored to the live experiences of the South Asian youth. We need to make it known to them that we are on their team, that their voices are being heard, that their suggestions are being taken, and that there's endless advice for them to seek. If we can't be a model in this way, then we also can't set an example for future generations that may have to deal with this as well, and for other youth ethnic groups that are dealing with their own problems. Ultimately, this project isn't just a discussion, it's a call to action. We need researchers, educators, and health professionals to dig deeper and spark some change. If we want real progress, it's not enough to simply know what's happening to the South Asian diaspora, but why it's happening in the first place. Thank you for listening. I hope this presentation was an eye-opener for a lot of you, and that it challenged your perspective as much as it did mine. I know for me, it was definitely a worthwhile and rewarding experience, and for that, I would like to thank Art MEDified for providing me with this research opportunity and for that experience. Of course, I would also like to thank the President, Ms. Hodge, and the Secretary, Ms. Pertler, for sticking with me on this tiresome journey.